As you know, this is the fourth message from the series we're doing, Joseph, a man with a mission. Israel's got talent. I wonder where you got that from. Israel's got talent. I'm going to be reading Genesis chapter 40. I'm reading from the NIV, which I have a New American Standard Study Bible, which I use most of the time. It's about that thick and it's heavy. So. The cupbearer and the baker. Genesis chapter 40. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After they'd been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there is no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat away your flesh." Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. I struggled with that message. I read my NIV, couldn't see anything in it. Read the King James, read the Amplified Bible, and I read the Message. And I couldn't see anything that I could get out of it. But before I tell you what happened, I want to go back to the beginning. My beginning, and you'll probably wonder where on earth is he going with this, but trust me, because I will get back to Joseph. I was born in 1941. The Blitz in London was coming to an end, and I can safely say that I survived the Blitz because my mother carried me in her womb for the 9 months while the bombs were dropping all around her. 6 months later, I was in hospital with gastric enteritis, and my mother was told that I would not live through the night. My father, who was a shift worker, came to the hospital at the end of his late shift to say goodbye. When he left the hospital in the war, he saw something glinting on the ground. There were no street, so it could possibly have been that maybe the moon was reflecting on this, and he picked it up. And it was a small horseshoe and slipper, the sort of thing that a bride would have had on a bouquet in those days. And he picked it up and he looked at it, and he offered up a prayer to God that I would survive the night. And he put the little trinket in his pocket, which I saw many times. And he started to walk up the road to catch his bus, and then he discovered he was in the wrong street, and he had to retrace his footsteps to go to the bus stop. 55 years later, I retired from my job as a maintenance technician in a food factory, and a year later, Pat and I moved out to Spain. And we were going out there for one thing, and that was to enjoy the lifestyle, the sun, the sea, and the sangria. We were not Christians. We had no intention of becoming Christians. Our plan was to have a good time. And if you want to put a smile on God's face, just tell him what your plans are. 3 years after moving out to Spain, we both became born-again Christians. We attended a small Christian fellowship in an old chicken shop in the heart of Torrevieja. Over the years that followed, Pat and I got involved in that church, and we helped to build it. It grew and moved to larger premises and into larger premises, and then it was having double services on a Sunday. It was getting bigger and bigger. Torrevieja Christian Fellowship became a pivotal point, welcoming people of all faiths in the old town of Torrevieja. And we involved ourselves in all aspects of that church, so much so that the DNA thread of that church still runs through us. We moved back to England 3 years ago, and I've been attending ABC for 2 years. Now, as I said to you earlier on, when I started this scripture, there was nothing there for me. And this was a little bit worrying, because I'd volunteered to come and do the message. I couldn't think. I always ask the Lord for help in this. Whenever I'm going to do a message, I always ask, what shall I do, Lord? What shall I talk about? What shall I preach about? And one night I'm lying in bed and I'm lying there thinking about it, and all of a sudden I can see myself preaching, and yet I didn't have nothing to preach about. And the words that come into my mind were prophecy, visions and dreams. So I asked God, what is it you want me to say? And it eventually became quite clear that what he was saying to me was this: listen for my voice. Not listen to my voice, listen for my voice. And I knew then that this passage said more to me about the way God talks to us and the way in which he directs our lives, rather than the fate of the cupbearer and the chief baker. For me, it was more about God's mission rather than Joseph's. Now, we know why Joseph was thrown into prison, but we don't know why Potiphar put 2 men into Joseph's charge. We can assume that Potiphar trusted Joseph now. But if that was the case, then that trust was instilled by God for the furtherance of God's plan to elevate Joseph and achieve deliverance from the famine that was about to fall on Egypt. When you look at how the King James Version describes Joseph's role in this, it's as a servant, which is all I suspect Joseph ever considered himself, nothing else. In verse 4 it says, and the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, and they continued a season in ward. And in verse 6 it says, and Joseph came in unto them in the morning, looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. Now Joseph was not asked by these 2 men to interpret their dreams. He was aware of their sadness, and he asked them why they were feeling that way. And they said, there's nobody to interpret the dreams. So Joseph took it upon himself to do this for them. And no doubt he was filled with the confidence that God had given him. God was moving Joseph to that goal, that end, although Joseph may not have been aware of it, but he was moving towards the final plan, the end of the plan. God speaks into our hearts as he spoke into Joseph's and probably spoke into those two men. He speaks into our hearts whether we understand that or not, whether we are believers or not. Now, I believe that as Christians we can spot and understand when God is speaking to us. Non-believers would say things like that are just a coincidence, and we know there's no word like coincidence in the Bible. As Christians, you can begin to see and understand and feel when the Holy Spirit moves you, when he talks to you. I'm not sure the two men did believe in God. They certainly believed in the interpretation of dreams. That was an accepted practice in ancient Egypt. And I've no doubt there were lots of people there, unscrupulous men and women, who ran lucrative businesses interpreting dreams. They do that nowadays, don't they? They call it, well, what do they call it? Do you read the stars? Horoscopes. Yeah. I often wonder about that when, you know, my star sign is Pisces, and they say, well, in the morning you're going to get a new job, you know. Well, if, you know, anyway, I don't think Joseph would really have questioned his ability to interpret these dreams when he was a young teenager. He was 17, wasn't he, when he told his brothers that they would bow down to him one day. And I suspect it would have been the bravado of his youth that gave him the confidence to make such a claim. When Doreen was preaching on this last week, she was talking about how she didn't like her big brother because he was such a knower, or the little brother. I can't remember if he was the little brother or the big brother. But you get these... I was the middle of three boys, right? Anything went wrong, the big boy, then my oldest brother, got into trouble for it. If there was any mischief got up to, it was always the little one who got into trouble for it. But me, because I was the middle one, I never got blamed for anything. I don't know if my brothers hated me or not. I hope they didn't. But Joseph had this bravado, and I can imagine him, you know, pointing at his brothers and saying, "You lot are going to bow down to me when one day," and because they came to dislike Joseph intensely. In that revelation, God was opening a window on the future for Joseph, and perhaps to a lesser extent to the family, which of course was to come after the famine. Now, we can't see into the future, but if God gives you the gift of prophecy, that's exactly what you will be capable of. But it can only happen when God tells you to. And I'm reminded of Jesus telling Peter how he would deny him 3 times before the cock crowed. We also see here a kind of a metaphor that mirrors the crucifixion of our Lord. Joseph is suffering duress even though he is guiltless, without blame, in the same way as our Lord was guiltless and without blame. Joseph doesn't blame anybody for that. The Lord never blamed anybody for the misdirections and the misgivings and all the rest of it. He never blamed anybody. The two men are like the thieves hanging on their respective crosses either side of Jesus. One will enjoy freedom while the other will suffer the pain of death. And in verse 20, the Pharaoh releases one but executes the other. And this happened on the 3rd day. Before the cupbearer was restored to his high position, Joseph asked him this in verse 14, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." There's a reference to this in Amos in chapter 6, verse 6. It says, "But you do not grieve over the ruin of Joseph." The cupbearer didn't grieve over the ruin of Joseph. He should have remembered his promise, but he did not. And of course we see again, Joseph still didn't blame anybody. He didn't blame his brothers for his demise. He didn't blame Potiphar's wife. But in the case of the cupbearer, his forgetfulness is ingratitude. And I have to ask us, are we like that? Is God reminding us here not to forget what Jesus did for us? Jesus released us from the penalty of hell and eternal damnation, from the kind of fate awaiting the chief baker. And we should never, ever forget that. Now, I mentioned prophecy, and this is a gift from God. In a sense, Joseph was prophesying when he interpreted those dreams. But usually anyone who does prophesy do so without being asked. They'll come up to you and they'll prophesy. They'll stand up and they'll prophesy. No one should ever dare to prophesy or interpret unless we know it's from God. Now, when I was a young Christian, not young in age, I must say, but young as a Christian in my walk with God, I often had people come up to me with a word from God, sometimes a vision. And initially I felt honoured to think God was actually thinking about me. But I soon came to realise that any word from a third party would always be confirmed by God if indeed it was from him. In the case of the two men in prison, confirmation came on the third day. And when people prophesy, they are simply relaying God's message. They can never claim it to be their own feeling or sense of what is about to happen. And Joseph made this clear when he told those two men that only God interprets dreams. A few years ago, I decided it was time for me to give up preaching. The reason for that was because the pastor of our church at the time, John Jessup, who incidentally used to play rugby for Leeds when he was a young man, he was retiring, and it was him who brought me to the pulpit to preach. And I thought it was the right time now for me to give up, because John was retiring, new pastor coming in, new broom sweeps clean, they wouldn't need me anymore. The following day I was reading 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and in verse 16 Paul says, "Woe to me if I do not preach." I knew I'd made the wrong decision, and it can come in many different ways. That's why it's important for us to listen for God's voice. Some years ago I prepared a message about the prodigal son, and I was using the idea of the black sheep. Remember the old saying about the black sheep of the family? I just want to explain this. There might be some farmers amongst you, so you may know this. The black sheep in the field, the sheep are grazing, and the levels of zinc in the field starts to decay, and the colour of the black sheep changes to grey, and that's when the shepherd knows he's got to move his sheep into fresh pasture. And I was going to preach this message on the prodigal son and the black sheep, and I'm in this little fellowship in a place called Pilar. And I was up at the front talking to somebody, I don't know, and as the people were coming to the church, a fellow walked in, he had a big kipper tie on, and it was full of white sheep, and right in the middle was a black sheep. I knew God was saying to me, you're on the right track, you know, and sometimes it gives you a shiver when you realise how God has actually spoken to you. Why did I tell you then about my deliverance from death as a 6-month-old infant? Well, you consider Joseph's years from his youth to the men in Egypt. God was preparing Joseph for something, but only God knew what. When my father took what he would have said was the wrong road, it actually turned out to be the right road. I believe God wanted me to help build a church in Spain. That church started off with 30 people in a little shop, and we ended up having gospel concerts and seminars, 500 people in the building. The journey we'd gone through, what we'd achieved, I don't mean me, Pat on our own, I mean the people that were involved. What we achieved, this was God's work. And I believe God had kept me going because he knew he wanted me later in life to help build this church in Spain. Not for my benefit, none of this. I don't know how many people came to the Lord through my preaching. I haven't got a clue. But I do recall getting very emotional after one Sunday message when 7 people responded to an altar call I put out, and they came up to give their lives to God. Now, one of those people might have gone on to do great work in the mission fields, Maybe that was the plan. I don't know. God didn't come back and say, well, by the way, Mick, this is what I wanted to do. You just don't know. You don't know what effect you're going to have on people. And it's all in God's plan. The same way that he got Joseph as a young kid. He knew what he was going to do with Joseph, but it wasn't going to happen for another 20 odd years. And I firmly believe that that is why God saved me as an infant. I'm no Billy Graham, and I'm certainly not Joseph. And in Romans 28, Roger French said this last week, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. I'm going to tell you a story about the way God speaks to you. And this is a remarkable little story. And it happened, we had a pastor, or a visiting pastor, come to our church, and this fella had a face like Walter Matthau. You remember Walter Matthau, Jack Lemmon? A real hangdog expression, this pastor. But he had a wonderful turn of phrase, very dry, very funny man. And he's from somewhere along the south coast, I believe. And he had a little Christian business where he made videos. He would write poems, little stories and things, all Christian. It was to help people, to instruct people, even people who were getting over bereavements. And his habit at the end of his services was to sit up here in a chair with his wife, and then people would come up and talk to him. And a woman come up to him, and as she walked up, he remembered this was a woman who had purchased from him a stack of videos and poems and all the rest of it, and she still owed him about, I don't know what it was, 150 quid. And this kind of money he needed to be able to purchase the materials to keep the business going. So she gets up to the pulpit, and she tells him she's so depressed she's now going to commit suicide. And he said, come on, God, what can I say to this woman? And he couldn't think of anything. And he's looking at her, poor heart out, and she's going to kill herself. She's going to kill herself. And he went, can you sign a cheque and send it to me before you commit suicide? And the woman got up and walked away. A couple of days later, the cheque came through the post and she never committed suicide. This bloke's wife said to him, what on earth did you say that for? He said, that's all I could think of. God kept saying to me, get the cheque, get the cheque, get the cheque. Yeah, so don't think it's all going to be, angels and harps and all the rest of it. You just, if you're a Christian, you'll recognise when God speaks to you. And I'm going to finish here now on a hymn. I'm going to speak this. This was written by the Reverend John Ellerton, who died in 1893. I need to say something before that. If you feel that you're not in that place where you can recognise God speaking to you, if you feel that you're not really given yourself to the Lord completely, then speak to me afterwards, because then I will help you, if you want, to talk you through how to ask Jesus into your life. This hymn is called The Day Thou Gavest, Lord, is Ended. The day Thou gavest, Lord, is ended. The darkness falls at Thy behest. To Thee our morning hymns ascended, Thy praise shall sanctify our rest. We thank Thee that Thy church, unsleeping, while earth rolls onward into light, through all the world her watch is keeping, and rests not now by day or night. As o'er each continent and island the dawn leads on another day, the voice of prayer is never silent, nor dies the strain of praise away. The sun that bids us rest is waking, our brethren neath the western sky, and hour by hour fresh lips are making Thy wondrous doings heard on high. So be it, Lord, Thy throne shall never, like earth's proud empires, pass away. Thy kingdom stands and grows forever, till all Thy creatures own Thy sway. We're now going to sing I've lost my schedule now. What's the hymn, Heather?